I'm very proud to moderate this panel with some serious heavyweights on it. And the title of this discussion is, what is the future for asset finance in super yachts and the private aviation world? And by way of very brief introduction for myself, I am a lawyer with Jaffa & Co. We are a law firm specialising in super yachts and private and commercial aviation. We've got offices in the UK and Monaco, and we specialise, amongst other things, in asset finance. And in 2020, we advised on assets worth several billion euros or dollars, depending on which currency you prefer. And hopefully that allows me to ask some poignant and vaguely intelligent questions. And we might even manage to get some humorous questions in there as well, who knows. Introducing the panel, we start with Bob Atkinson. So Bob founded his company B Capital in 2012, and before that he spent 10 years at Barclays Bank. He's widely regarded as an expert in asset finance when it comes to yachts and jets, and he scours the broader market away from the private banks, although I'm sure he includes the private banks as well, but he looks at the whole market for clients, for principals who are sourcing finance and pure asset finance away from the private banking relationship. We've then got Michel Buffat, who has spent 17 years with Credit Suisse. Hi, Michel. We've known each other some years.
Hi, everyone.
Morning. I didn't actually allow Bob to say hello, which was quite rude. Let's back up. Bob, say hello.
Hello. Say hello. Hi, James.
Hello.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Try and keep it humorous, James.
Yeah, well, you know, it is a serious business, but it's nice to smile as well. Michel, nice to see you. Good morning.
Nice to see you too.
Michel, as I was saying, 17 years at Credit Suisse. You head the yacht and jet finance globally, the bank's global offering, based in Zurich, and we can come on to a few more details in due course. Marie-Laure Gassier, if I pronounce that right, my French accent is appalling, I'm sorry. Morning. So you're with BNP Paribas, 15 years in aviation finance, and now that offering has been merged within the bank to include super yachts, previously based in Asia, France, Paris specifically, and now back in Switzerland, and a wealth of experience across both yachts and jets. And then we come to Paul Cawley, who has probably been the busiest man in the world over the last 3 years, because amongst other things, he is an expert in Brexit and how it's affecting aviation and yacht clients, owners throughout Europe, and free circulation of the assets within the territory, the customs territories. Paul, you're with KPMG, based in the Isle of Man, an expert on indirect taxes, and I think I've probably covered everything else that you do, but you're in particular over the last 3 years, you've made it your lucky task to become the expert on how Brexit has affected things.
I have indeed, yeah. It's been an absolute hoot.
Excellent. Well, we get asked enough questions on it, so you know, at least you're the man to ask. Now we're going to kick off. We've got a list of panel discussion topics which we're going to run through, and the first one is nice and broad. And because of its breadth, I think the person to come to is probably Bob, given that he scours the whole market. And the question is, where are we finding finance for yachts and jets now, and where do you think it's going to go in the future?
All right. Well, thank you, James. Yes, I mean we literally do scour the market, so we're looking for finance options for whatever the transaction is. So I mean, you have the entire market where, from the private bank's point of view, they have their selected areas of interest that they focus in on. From our point of view, we see transactions from well, a couple of million euros upwards. I mean, most of the sector that I guess we see is probably 30 meters to 60, 65 meters, to be honest. So you've got all sorts of people in there. So you're starting off really with the value of the vessel, the size of the vessel, the age of the vessel, its use as from an asset point of view, which will determine whether you've got some finances you can work with. Then there is clearly the client side of things. The SPVs are always going to be in a jurisdiction that works. It's really with each transaction, the financier is looking for recourse via a personal guarantee, sometimes from a corporate guarantee, through to the UBO or his structure somewhere. And it's really the nationality and residency and where that income is coming from for that UBO that will determine whether it has a fit. I mean, you have some funders that will look at vessels at the very small end. They're usually within country, within their own jurisdictions that they are able to finance. It's almost on the edge of retail financing, I suppose. And those are deals of a size where it just doesn't warrant cross-border transactions. It doesn't warrant employing lawyers that carry a cost, might I suggest, James. If you've got if it's going cross-border, then all of a sudden you're ramping up legal costs, legal opinions, and if it's a deal for sort of 2, 3, 4, 5 million, there's a disproportionate amount of cost that goes with it. So it's really a case of trying to. There are some funders that will work within country. You get to a point where there is a bit of a gap in the market, I find, and it's usually in the area where the loan amount is probably 5 to 10 million, somewhere in that area.
So where do you actually go? So this is a bit of a dark art that I've never understood, and I'm quite interested to know. And you may just not want to give away your closely guarded trade secrets, but where do you go? So say we get a German client through our door, and we come to you and say, Bob, this client's buying a 40-meter yacht. They'd like to finance it because they can get a 12 or 15% return on their capital in their business,
Sure.
and they can pay 4, 5, 6% perhaps interest on the finance.
Yeah.
What do? You go to Germany first, or you go to the UK where you're based, or the US? Where do you head?
There's a bundle of questions really, and it is that client solely centered in Germany as an example, or do they have I don't know, a property in Geneva, in the south of France, in the UK, in the States? That will give us a bit of a flavour as to what other avenues there may be. Yes, there are some funders in Germany, there are some funders in Austria, but it's of a size, I would suggest that it's a 40-meter. Probably depends if it's new or if it's a brokered deal. If it's a 40-meter vessel for a German buyer, and it's costing, I know it's 5 years old and it's costing 10 million, 9 million or something, then that is a tricky deal for the likes of Michel and Marie-Laure, for those sort of banks, I would suggest, to look at, and they can.
We'll let them respond.
They will respond, I'm sure, in a moment or two. But from and you mentioned the key point there, where it is, if that guy or the lady owner of that vessel, the buyer of that vessel, is an entrepreneur, and it's their first vessel, and they've not accumulated 100 million of assets and cash and investments and things, they're still growing their business and they're generating 10, 12, 15% return out of their business. They don't really want to be using their cash to buy it, but they do want to borrow.
Yeah. And
don't really want to be putting some of that cash that they might have sitting with a private bank to generate a level of return and costs that are associated with it. So in answer to your question, yes, there are some funders out there that will finance at maybe 4.5%, 5%, 6% interest rate on an asset basis. But regrettably, there are not dozens of them. Yeah. There are only a handful out there. So yes, that's the current position.
Okay. And because Marie-Laure smiled first, I'll go to her next. Michel was very close behind. So
tell me how it is, Marie-Laure.
The question was, where are clients finding finance now? And from what I'm seeing, we still do work with the big Swiss banks. It's interesting that that Bob says there's, the 5 to 10 million loan facility bracket might not be suited to the private banking relationship. Would you mind, or would you care to elaborate on that, or just give us your thoughts?
Yes, so thank you very much. Actually, I think financing is generally speaking available for business jet and yachts, more for business jet than for yachts, because there are more banks willing to finance this type of assets. So financing is not a scarce resource. I mean, for business jet at least it's available. Now it depends to a large extent on the geographical area where the client is based. If the client is based in the US, it's completely different than from a client based in Europe. It depends on the type of asset, on the size, on the price, what Bob explained. And it also depends on the nature of the buyer. If it's a private client, a private individual, it's not the same approach as for a corporate. So as far as we are concerned, BNP Paribas, but it's the same for, I would say, European private banks, we are serving ultra net worth individuals, so wealthy private individuals, primarily when they buy mid-size and large cabin aircraft or mega yachts, super yachts above 35-40 meters. There are other financial institutions that are serving corporates or that may be interested in smaller assets. But I think it's important to have the key criteria in mind to find the right financing institution when clients want to get financing. And then just to get back on to what Bob said, yes, it's not easy to find financing for assets, let's say around 5-6 million, because I mean, the financing structure is relatively complex and heavy, and we need a sizable transaction for this transaction to make this financing to make sense for the client. So if the transaction is too small, client may find it a little bit too heavy and too expensive. So
you touched upon
it may be easier to find financing for bigger assets than for smaller ones in some cases.
And we have some rather large assets being financed now and have been for some time with BNP, particularly on the large yacht front, and a couple of 70-meter yachts spring to mind immediately. You touched on something though that I'm interested to know more about, which is on the aviation side. Unlike yachts, where they are ultimately pure toys and just holidays for friends and family, which is their primary function, with aviation assets, there is almost always a business element to it as well. And my question to you is it easier for clients to come and finance a jet acquisition using their corporate, using their business, rather than as an individual? Because is it a less onerous process? Do you not require the private banking relationship to bring them through the door and onboard them? Or does it make no difference?
It does make a difference. It does make a difference because I mean, in Europe, the way we approach business jet financing is that we always need to have a recourse. So we finance the asset. The asset is a primary security for the bank. And so we pay a lot of attention to the quality of the asset, the maintenance, the value through the time. But we also want to have a recourse on the beneficial owner. And when the beneficial owner is a private individual, we will pay attention to the net worth, to the repayment sources, to the revenues, recurrent revenues, liquid wealth, this type of things which can allow to repay the financing. When the beneficial owner is a corporate, then we need to look at the balance sheet, the country of businesses, the nature of the business. So it will be a corporate analysis rather than a private banking analysis. So it's really two different departments from the banks who can, which can look at these different opportunities. This is very important. And then I think what can allow to go from one side to the other is that, as you said, I mean, a business jet is primarily a business tool. So it allows to save time. And when we have clients who are still active in their professional life, their business jet is used both for private and business purposes. So the question is, are they going to buy it private and lease it to their company? Or is it going to be a corporate asset that is occasionally leased to the one of the shareholders for leisure or private purposes. So depending who owns the asset, we will take a corporate view or a private banking view.
And does it make it easier if they come and say, I'm going to finance primarily as an individual and lease it to my business, or it's predominantly going to be used for business purposes? Does it make it easier in a yes or no answer fashion?
No, I think that it's not easier or more difficult. It's I mean, as a private bank, we are financing this type of assets for private individuals. So if they come to us, we are interested in wealthy clients willing to buy these assets under their personal capacity. I think the corporate financing is broadly available in the US. It also exists in Europe, but for private banking, I mean, when business jet financing is granted with a private banking angle, we are more focusing on private banking clients.
Okay, thank you.
And to answer your question differently, if the corporate, if a corporate company wants to buy a business jet and they have a weak balance sheet, it's going to be difficult. If they have a very strong balance sheet and good banking relationship, they will probably.
It will be more simple. Yeah. Thank you very much. Now, Michel and Paul, by all means, raise any comments you would like to on these topics. But we've got a few questions, and I might just move on. And the next one naturally falls to Michel, I think, if that's okay. And I really do mean it. Just shout or raise your hand or whatever you might do if you want to add something. The next question we've got is, what are the differences, but also the synergies between business aviation and super yachts? And I think it falls to Michel in particular, because I know you've been doing both asset classes for such a long time at Credit Suisse. How do they differ? How are they the same?
Yes, I would say it's very similar, at least the way we deal with it. Our idea of what we do is very similar to what Marie-Laure mentioned. We want to finance private individuals who buy these sorts of assets. And before it was discussed, is there a difference if the jet is mainly used by the company or not? I mean, for us, we don't make a big difference, because ultimately we look at the person behind the company and we think of financing him. If let's say, even if the guarantor is going to be a company, but ultimately the beneficial owner will own the company. So we look at the cash flow generated also by the company for the owner. So it's very similar. It's very focused on the private banking client, which is always a requirement. There's no secret. We don't finance standalone. So we look at this person, and then if this person buys a yacht or a jet, we don't make a big difference. So when we look at the two assets, and so very similar products. What we see now, happening, especially with the larger clients, that they have both assets. They might have a yacht, they might have a jet, they might even have a helicopter on the yacht or so.
Yeah.
Here we have done deals where we kind of combined the assets. That we did not do three financings, but we did one combined facility. I mean, we're also looking at real estate financing. We do have also a real estate financing team, which is very close in the organization to what I'm doing. And we have looked at combining deals, especially equity releases on, let's say, the yacht, the real estate, and the jet. And then with this equity that was released, then we can work in the private bank and use all assets as common security. So kind of combining all these facilities. So these are typically then the synergies, if you may say, that for the client that we can offer on these products. And for our side, of course, since aircraft and yacht is the same, of course, this is much easier to combine. And
one of the questions, so people are doing in the audience are doing my job for me, which is making life much easier for me. Although it turns out my brain struggles to do two things at once, which is listen to and read. But Ian Petts has said there's a greater volume of data on values and engine and airframe hours, which helps with valuation benchmarks. And I think from my experience, that's probably correct. Or not probably, it is correct. But does it make your life easier? And this is really to you, Michel, Marie-Laure, and Bob. Does it make life easier having that additional data that you can reference?
Maybe if I can start, it definitely does make it easier. It also, I mean, the whole markets, you have more numbers of a certain aircraft type, and they all are almost the same. And interior might be different, but in principle they are the same model. Whereas with yachts, especially if you go to the, I would say, 70 meter plus segment, then each yacht is very different from the other. So it in fact makes it much easier to value jets. And this because you can predict
depreciation and what happens in the event of a default.
You can do statistics. I mean, even though the numbers are not very big, but still you can do statistics. You have people who do nothing else but the valuation, and you have the database, the various databases, etc. So it's very transparent in that sense. As with yachts, it's not. And then, of course, the result is that the loan to values that you can get on the yacht is typically lower than what you can get on an aircraft, because we feel more comfortable, so we can go higher. Otherwise, for yachts, we need some cushion to be on the safe side if something goes wrong.
And that leads on to a question that's not on the script, but which I'm very interested to hear about. What is happening in the market at the moment? So it has been a turbulent year, and from what we have seen, but also I think the whole market has seen, an uptick in the acquisition of certainly used brokerage aircraft and yachts. But it has been a turbulent time. And have you been seeing defaults on a higher level than you would ordinarily? Question. Marie-Laure, it's coming in your time. Well, unless Bob got there first.
Well, well, we haven't seen many defaults because we have good clients, but no, generally speaking, yes. I think I mean, there were probably some distressed situations, but I mean, we have clients who are wealthy enough so that when they are in a difficult situation, they can manage the situation properly, meaning that most of the time they let the bank know in advance that they are going to be, the situation is going to be tight for them. They have less liquidity and they would like to sell their assets. And then the question is how is the market? And what we have seen, I mean, Bob or Michel can confirm, but the market was like in a pause mode in Q2 2020. Everybody was extremely surprised with the situation. So there were very few transactions, not because the bank didn't want to finance, but just because it was impossible to organize deliveries, the transfer of ownership and everything. And then gradually, starting from Q3, we have seen some clients coming back, some new requests, a new type of request also for pre-owned assets, for smaller assets. So the market became gradually more active. And I think now the market is very active. So if some clients have been sharply impacted by the crisis and need to sell the asset, I have almost no doubt that they will find a buyer. And I don't think there are so many distressed assets on the market. So the prices are relatively resilient.
And Bob, you're nodding.
Yeah, I am. I don't think, excuse me, I don't see distressed assets out there at all at the moment. I think the market, certainly the yacht market has been pretty buoyant. And I agree exactly with Marie-Laure. I mean, I think it died in March. It was sort of June, July time when it started to come back. We did a couple of deals in the summer, which I was surprised by, but we did. And it's been pretty buoyant since. And as I say, there's a lot of brokerage deals there in the 40, 50 meter sector is what I've seen. And it's, you know, if you want a high quality 50-meter yacht at the moment, I think you may be a second-hand yacht. You may be struggling. The good ones have almost gone, and people are using them more. I think owners are. There's been new buyers that have come into the market, and if people have been able to afford to buy or have resources to acquire it or borrow, I think people have got to a point where they've been locked up. A yacht is a good way to get away. It's a good base. If they've had thoughts about it for a long time, I think people have thought, well, we're not going to live forever. Let's just get on and enjoy life a little bit. And I think there's been a certain amount of that. Get on with it.
Great places to isolate as well. So there's the additional reason to go into it.
And if a country goes into lockdown, you can just move along the Mediterranean to get away. I think
it's the same thing if you want to buy a 2 or 3 year old good quality aircraft. The market is very, very dry at the moment, and you may have some difficulties in finding this type of good quality asset. And
we play a slightly different role to you guys because we're a law firm, and we as a law firm, we represent predominantly owners, but also shipyards and some financiers, and we tend to, but most of our business comes through brokerage. And I've had a pattern of clients over the last 12 months or 8 to 9 months in particular who have come and said, I'm interested, I found this yacht, I'm hanging out for the best price because there's going to be a coronavirus deal in it for me. And for good quality inventory, it's never arrived that price that they expected. And they have consistently come back sort of 6 weeks later, if the yacht was still available, and paid a very strong price for the asset. And also something I've never seen before, that old brokerage trick, and we're built on brokerage before all the brokers watching hang me out to dry. But drive enthusiasm and say there's buyers queuing up. This year, there really have been, and we've had clients lose boats from 30 meters to 60 meters plus, where the purchaser or prospective purchaser has been told, we really have another client wanting to buy it. And they have said, yeah, I've heard that trick before. But then the yacht really does go. So to find quality inventory at the moment seems to be quite scarce. So we're all on the same page. And moving on, because Paul has been sitting there very quietly, and I've not forgotten you, I promise. I think there's a whole section coming your way, Paul, where none of us can really answer too much on it. And it's all for you. And I think the moment has arrived. And the question is, what VAT and customs considerations need to be considered in the UK and EU when acquiring a jet? And that is perfectly suited to you because so much has changed with the customs union over the last year.
Yeah, I mean, with aircraft, there are separate considerations for yachts and aircraft, but if you specifically to drill into aircraft, you're splitting the issue between whether the asset was purchased and owned prior to Brexit or after Brexit. If we're looking at a purchase of a jet after Brexit now, then what you have is 2 separate customs territories, which was the result of the transitional period on the 31st of December. So if an owner is buying an aircraft now, they're likely to need to import it somewhere in order to be able to travel under free circulation for customs purposes. And if you import an aircraft through the UK, that will just give you UK free circulation. And I include the Crown dependencies in that as well. Whereas if you import an aircraft through the EU, it will give you EU customs status. Effectively, what Brexit has done is produce this position where you can't be in free circulation in both places by importing through just one territory, be it an EU member state or a UK. And so you have to pick really which is the most appropriate place to import through. It's usually a fairly obvious decision. If you live in the EU, you would need to import your aircraft into the EU because you wouldn't meet the conditions for temporary admission there. And the same applies to the UK. You know, if you lived in the UK, then you would need to import the aircraft through the UK. Where the more tricky dilemmas come in is if actually, say you have an owner, they live in the EU, but also they have sufficient or significant interest in the UK as well, then they'd be potentially looking at a dual importation, you know, through both locations.
By which you mean you have to pay VAT potentially in both customs unions?
Well, but potentially, I mean, there are, yeah, I mean, potentially, I mean, there's planning to be done around that. I mean, we're importing an aircraft tomorrow through the UK, and that aircraft will actually meet the conditions for temporary admission in the EU.
So just to explain, really, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, just to explain really briefly in layman's terms, temporary admission allows non-European owners or non-UK owners, and I don't want to answer the question for you. I'll just ask the question.
No, yeah, no, it's fine, it's fine. Yeah, so you have two possible customs statuses or importations. You can either import formally, which is pay the VAT and duty, if VAT and duty is due on that formal importation process, and you'll know you're doing that because you'll be dealing with the local customs authority and what have you. Or you can operate under temporary admission. And so historically what's happened under temporary admission is you would have, say, you know, a Cayman owned yacht and flagged, entirely owned outside the EU, and it would be able to come into the EU under temporary admission without paying any VAT or duty, provided it doesn't operate commercially. And so
is there a time limit on that? Is there a time limit on that importation?
Yeah, so 6 months and 18 months, depending on whether it's a yacht or an aircraft. So you had to adhere to time limits, but often the time limits aren't such an issue because with the yachts, they're often sailing out to the Caribbean, you know, once a year, or even just to a neighbouring EU country that's outside the member states.
Okay.
But to sort of get back to that sort of central importation dilemma, if you like, you know, if we in respect of the aircraft that we have tomorrow, they just don't have the appetite for temporary admission because a lot of owners see issues with operating under TA. They think there's a risk attached to that. And so what they're doing is they're importing the aircraft through the UK tomorrow, and then they're going to import it through the Netherlands as well. And we're seeing quite a lot of that.
So they're going to pay VAT in both territories?
Well, what they will pay VAT in both territories, but they will obtain VAT recovery as well in line with their business activities. So in respect, yeah, in both, and you know that's not always possible. It depends whether if the asset is really used for non-business purposes, then there's the potential of an actual VAT payment on that asset. Whereas,
but for those, I'm sorry, I don't mean to keep interrupting, but just for those listening who don't do this every day. So if you're a commercial asset, a commercial yacht or a commercial jet, the headline term is you can reclaim the VAT, and you have a non-VAT paid asset that's got free circulation.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it does get complicated. I mean, if you have if you look specifically at aircraft, which was the sort of key question, then if that aircraft is operated on an AOC, you know, if it's a truly commercial aircraft and it's chartered out to third parties, then that sector is broadly zero rated, that type of asset. So you'd be able to zero rate that import. But if you have a corporate aircraft which is owned by a UBO that has a global business group, a global corporate group, and it uses that aircraft for the purposes of servicing their business needs, then that'll generally be a standard rated import, and the recovery of that importation, the VAT on that import, is based on it being operated for business purposes within the corporate group.
And then how has this changed? So just to get back to the question, how's it changed because of Brexit? So now you need to be processed into both the UK, if you have a UK element, and Europe.
Unless you can use temporary admission. And so you know, say you have so you meet the conditions for temporary admission in the EU and you're quite happy to operate under temporary admission, then you could just import through the UK. That's assuming it's a UK owner. But yeah, the opposite principle applies to an EU individual with an EU aircraft or yacht. You know, you don't tend to see yachts sailing from the EU to the UK too often, so that's a bit anomalous as a journey. Yeah.
So one of the silver linings of Brexit for UK clients, UK owners of yachts and jets, one must never talk about either religion or politics in open forum, because you will always offend somebody. But whether you love Brexit or loathe it, one advantage is that UK clients can now put their yachts, if we move over to yachts, although it applies to jets, but yachts, which typically cruise within the Mediterranean, they can have a privately owned, privately structured yacht floating in the Mediterranean, which they now no longer have to pay VAT on if it's structured correctly, which effectively means that some yachts, for some owners, UK owners, are 20% cheaper than they were before Brexit.
That's true. And it's the same position, if you like, as, say, a Cayman structure, you know, before Brexit. And, you know, there's a specific transaction I'm working on at the moment where we have a UK individual and they're purchasing a yacht from a northern EU yard, and the yard is going to export it, brand new boat, so the yard is going to export it from the EU. The owner will take title to that vessel after it's been exported, and it will be purchased by an Isle of Man company, and they'll sail that straight down to the European, into the Mediterranean. And there won't be any VAT paid on that because they meet the conditions for temporary admission. It's privately operated, Isle of Man flagged, Isle of Man owned. And so that will meet the conditions for temporary admission in the EU. So yeah, it's exactly what you say, which sounds quite odd when you've been living in a VAT territory for forever. But it's exactly what owners have been enjoying through places like the Cayman Islands, if you like.
Yes, we took delivery this week of a 50-metre for a UK owner. This is not classified information, and the yacht will cruise under temporary admission. And my fear was that although we comply with the rules of temporary admission, the owner is established outside of the EU, and the yacht is structured appropriately. I still have this fear because it's so new and relatively untested. We've been taking tax opinions to confirm that they've all consistently said, yeah, now for UK owners, you go and cruise to your heart's content without paying the VAT privately, that is, in Europe. So it's been a big change for us as a law firm working with clients. It's been a huge change. And then I think let's move on to another question. So following the theme of one must never talk about politics in open forum, I've got a title here for our discussion. What has been the impact of the US election? Now, does anybody have any thoughts on that? Or it's not my question, I have no thoughts.
Well, I can say, and on our business, there has been no effect because we are not active in the US, so we don't finance US domiciled people. And I think there would have been the biggest effect. I hear there were some transactions, aircraft that people towards the end of the year, last year, with these tax benefits that you can get, this depreciation benefit. So there have been some transaction. In fact, one of our clients sold his aircraft to the US in exactly such a transaction. There was some effect, but the markets where we are, I mean, we are very strong in Europe, Western, Eastern Europe, Middle East, and there was no direct impact. We saw, last year was anyway a special year with a year-end rally, but I think this was more what people had in aviation, as Marie-Laure just mentioned. You know, people wanted to buy but could not because they could not do the pre-buy inspection. They could not go and visit the aircraft and see it physically. So there was many transactions that were kind of pending, and then when everything got better towards the end of the year, they all did it. So I think it's more the effect that we saw at the end of the year was much more from the pandemic than from the US election.
There was a tax exemption in the US, which I'm by no means an expert on, but I was led to believe by the brokerage industry in particular that the tax advantage which allowed US owners to offset the acquisition of certain assets, namely aircraft, against their income tax liability, was driving demand purchasing from Europe. And there was a large Monaco brokerage, jet brokerage firm, which I won't mention, but may well be watching, who said in particular they saw a flurry of activity trying to buy aircraft into the US before Trump left office, in case Biden came in and changed that advantage. Did anybody on the panel see anything or hear anything about that? And given that I have very little extra to add, apart from knowing of it as a concept, if nobody has anything to add, we'll move on. But there was definitely a drive to take inventory across the Atlantic because of it.
I mean, I've not been involved in transactions like that, but yes, I mean, that my understanding and talking to some of the banks in the States, yes, there's a big demand because the belief was that the US regime would change the tax rules. As I understand it, the tax rules in the US still remain the same. It's not reached the top of President Biden's pile of things to do or review yet.
He's a bit busy.
He's a bit busy, that's right. Got a few things to sort out. So I mean, I think the belief is that it may well be withdrawn, this tax incentive, exactly as Michel described there. So there's a big push for people to, if companies have got year ends at the end of December, if they bought an aircraft, it's like the old finance leasing way back, because I'm of an age where you got 100% first year allowances once upon a time. So if you buy that aircraft and it's $10 million and you're buying it in you put it through you could get tax relief for the 100% of that purchase price within your tax year. So if you buy it in December and you've got a year end and tax return of December, then you can offset it straight away. You bought it in January, you've got to wait the whole 12 months to get to the benefit of your reduced or offset the tax. But I mean, what was difficult, I think, was that for US buyers to buy aircraft out of the US, if there was an aircraft to be bought and they could find it in the US, it was considerably easier to do it rather than having to, it gets back to the inspection side of things, physically get over to Europe to inspect an aircraft with every rule that different countries have got on the ground as to whether people can get in or not, go back to the States, et cetera, and quarantine. So I think if there's an aircraft for sale that suited the bill reasonably, that was generally going to be bought in the US in preference to a European aircraft. But beyond there, I've not specifically seen activity myself like that.
I completely agree. I think that the US election have probably created some stress on the market, but generally speaking, I don't think it had a lot of impact on the business jet market specifically. The tax incentive scheme has certainly stimulated the market when Trump was elected. But then the buyers who wanted to benefit from this situation have probably had plenty of time to do it during the first 2 years after the election. I'm not sure it had a major impact during, just before the last election, because the people who wanted to benefit from it did it before.
Okay.
That's about as far as my knowledge goes, I'm afraid, James. It's slightly off piste for me, that one.
That's okay. That's okay. And I'm trying to multitask because there was a question which others might have seen as well. So going back to the US, there was a tax. So this question comes from Hein Velema, another good friend, a very well-known personality in the industry. How about the duty on US-built yachts and tenders? And I know that extends to so US-built yachts and tenders, and that's all to do with the Chinese tax on steel, I believe, and bringing US yachts into the Med, in particular for things like to charter in the Mediterranean season, became a hot topic of conversation last year. Paul, did you come across that in your travels?
We've seen bits on that, yeah. I mean, for yachts, there's still a concession for applying a zero rate of duty to yachts in the EU. If you look at the tariff, the EU tariff for importations of yachts, that hasn't changed as a result of Brexit, and it won't do. But you can still apply a zero rate for most yachts which come in. So I think the application of it is probably being very narrow or just passed. In terms of aircraft, the duty rates are still zero in both the UK and the Isle of Man for all civil aircraft, which is effectively everything. So I don't see duty as being a particularly difficult issue, but certainly VAT treatments can be a lot more challenging with the limited availability of jurisdictions through which to neutralise VAT.
Thank you very much. I'm just looking down at the questions because we've got 10 minutes left to go. The other questions are, how is the market doing during the pandemic, and is now the right time to buy aircraft or yachts? And we've touched upon it, but if anybody has anything to add, it would be very well received, I'm sure.
Maybe one.
And let's keep it back to finance.
Yeah.
Is now the right time to buy with finance?
Yeah, of course, it's always.
Yes.
No, look, when we talk about, right time to buy is also the question with the pricing, etc. So we just ran an analysis because, at the beginning of the crisis, of course, we were very worried that this could end up in something like, after the financial crisis, where we had, price drops of aircraft models up to 40% within 1 year. So that can be quite scary as a bank. So we looked at the numbers now, after 1 year, and it's interesting to see that in some sense, the 2020 was very similar to 2019. Now, some aircraft models, they lost about the same amount of value in 2019 than in 2020. So in that, if you would not know that there's a pandemic, you would not really notice that this is a big difference, which is, I think, is quite interesting. So yes, of course, it's a good time to buy now, but I think in general, it's not a much better time to buy now than it was maybe 1 year ago or so, or 1.5 years ago. So I think there is no big difference. And even more in yachting, we see also there we looked at prices. Yes, some yachts lost value, but this is because they got 1 year older and they lose value anyway. This is but otherwise, in the yacht market, I think, at least what we see, there is almost zero effect on the pandemic, which is quite interesting. So yes, of course, it's good to buy an asset now, but it's not particularly good. And certainly it's not, if you wait another month or a few months, you will not get a better deal, I'm sure.
I am seeing a pattern at my end as a law firm. So we totted up the live transactions we've got going on recently, and we had about 35. So we see a reasonable amount at any one time of buying, selling, and a good portion of those will finance. And I am seeing a pattern where owners are buying assets and with their own cash and choosing to refinance shortly afterwards, which I can't see that's due to the pandemic, unless the people still buying jets and yachts are doing very well because of the pandemic, which of course lots of people are, because uncertainty creates opportunity in their business lives. But consistently at the moment, we've got people who are buying, and then we've got two this week, one jet, one large yacht, buying and then refinancing 48 hours later, and we're lining up the finance so it's ready to go, but they're not pulling the trigger, and they're not pulling the trigger until they've bought the yacht, and it's making life simpler from the acquisition side of things because they get clean title. The incoming lender knows that the borrower has title already. They don't have to deal with escrow arrangements at completion where the bank is involved in paying the purchase price. And whilst that may not and will not be available for lots of people because they want or need the finance, need being a relative term, because if you need the finance, you probably won't get it, has always been my understanding. But if you are going to finance and you need the money to buy the yacht or the jet, that's one thing. Are you seeing that kind of pattern as well, where they're financing just after buying the asset, or is it just, am I unique?
I mean, we've got one. Sorry.
Who else? Marie-Laure, you
no,
please.
I'm just saying that I think you partially answered your own question. I think when client can afford it, it's probably easier for everybody to pay the asset cash and then to refinance it afterwards, shortly afterwards, or a little bit later. As you said, I mean, it saves legal cost because you don't need to have the escrow agreement, the escrow agent, all this complexity. If the seller is already financed, this is already relatively complex. So it's better not to have two banks in the same escrow agreement. So for many reasons, it will be simpler to do it this way. Sometimes also clients are not absolutely sure that they need financing. So they are busy with the acquisition, and so they do one thing at a time. And then they consider the benefit of having the asset financed, whether it is for a jet or for yachts. And I think all the banks who are providing business jet and yacht financing are also able to refinance assets that have already been acquired. So the financing doesn't need to be put in place on the purchase, on the date of the acquisition. It can also be refinanced later. And one thing that has not been mentioned that I totally agree with Michel, I mean, the prices are probably not more favorable than 1 year ago. The prices are reasonable for the moment, so it's the right time to buy, but interest rates are lower, especially for business jet than 1 year ago. So from this perspective, it can make sense, and we saw some clients who took delivery of their aircraft in early 2019, and they have refinanced it later just because they found that it was the right time to finance an aircraft because of the extremely low interest rate, especially for US, for the dollars.
So if you had to, if in sort of just one word answer to each of you, Marie-Laure, Michel, and Bob, if I am a client and I'm taking a 20 million euro loan facility against, let's say, an aircraft over 5 years, what interest rate am I looking at right now? And we won't hold you to it. And I know there are many factors, but are we looking at 1%, 15%, 90%, 4%? What number would you put on it if you had to put a round figure?
Well, I would say that if you finance an aircraft, it's probably better to get it financed in US dollars than in euro because the market is in US dollars.
Okay, but so switch either currency or asset. Let's go to yachts. 20 million yacht finance. What interest rate?
I think interest rate for yachts are slightly higher than for business jet, but I mean the market is somewhere between 2.50 and 4%, depending on the credit history of the client, on the yacht, on the shipyard, on many factors, the security package. So it's very difficult to be very precise, but I think generally speaking, we should be within, yeah.
Thank you. And then Michel, Bob, do you agree with that? Similar rates?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it's a market, a competitive market, and I would assume that at the end of the day, pricings are very similar that you can get, especially between the larger banks in the market. Yeah, it's in this range that Marie-Laure mentioned, and it really depends on the client and also on the jurisdiction, depending, let's say if we have somebody in Switzerland domiciled with a large Swiss company, then the price level is certainly different than if we have somebody in a country where let's say it would not be so easy to repossess or to enforce the personal guarantee. There we have a completely different risk profile, so you can also expect a higher margin which is then in the range, upper range, 3% or whatever.
Thanks, Michel. Bob, quickly, because I can see we're running out of time.
Exactly. I mean, it very much depends. I mean, the pricing there that the guys have mentioned is very much a private banking pricing, I would say 2.5 upwards. You're not getting very many asset financiers for either of those assets at 2.5. It's going to be higher than that if it's non-private banking. But they'll range from, your range will be from 2.5 maybe to 5.5, 6, across the whole band of be it aircraft and yachts. There's financing out there in that sort of bracket, be it private banking or non-private banking.
Thanks, Bob. And then very finally, Paul, indirect taxes. Any view at all on finance rates? Just say what the others said.
18%.
Exactly. You took the words right out of my mouth, James. Yeah. In that bracket. Excellent. Sorry. Yeah.
Thanks, guys. I suspect we're out of time.
Sadly, we are, James. Yes. Thank you very much. Well, look, James, I'd like to extend a thank you to you and all the panelists today. I know somebody in the chat here, Paul Caver, said excellent moderating, James. So I'd just like to second that.
Thanks.
No, in the nicest way you make it.
Him there. I've paid him £10 to
Did you really?
Comment in there, so.
You wanted euros.
Say.
You wanted euros, yeah, or dollars. Thanks, Paul.
But in the nicest way, that you made it look easy, and thank